I'm looking at our list of participants, and I am so glad to see so many of you participating today with our NASPA Alabama New Professional Institute. I am Dr. Abby Langham. I am the Director of Assessment and Strategic Planning at Auburn University for Student Affairs. I think that the session is a little bit different where I can talk, but I can't necessarily hear you unless we've enabled audio. So certainly if you have questions, put them in the chat. I've got that up and we'll keep tabs on that throughout. And if you feel the need to enable your audio and ask a question that way, I'm fine with that as well. Danny is on and some of our NASPA Alabama board members. So if we run into any difficulties, I have full faith that they will help us see those through. But I think we'll be just fine today. So really quickly, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about kind of an introduction to student affairs assessment. In the chat, how many of you, is this your first NASPA Alabama? If this is your first NASPA Alabama, say yes. Shelby, all right. Yay. Maybe I should have asked it this way. And this is where we're going to talk about the types of questions that you ask. Has anyone, let's see, have you attended NASPA Alabama before? Would have been another way to ask that. So, okay, so this is your first time for several of you. That's great to know. All right, and I know Shelby because she works at Auburn, and some of you have your roles there on the People tab, so I can see kind of what you do within student affairs at your own institutions. So normally when I do a session like this, I would take a quick poll where we'd be face-to-face, and I would say, you know, what are your field areas in student affairs? How many of you are new to student affairs? In general, how many of you have been working in, you know, higher education for a little while, those kinds of things. And then I tailor my presentation to the way that you answer on those questions. And my reason for doing that, one, is to provide you with the best information that I can, but also to provide you a quick formative example of assessment in practice. And so that's exactly what that would have been. I think I can get the sense from the chat and just from your roles in the people section as to what it is that you do for the most part. But just know that it's okay to do a quick poll like that and then tailor your presentation or tailor what you're teaching to students. And that would be called formative assessment. So we'll just jump in there since it's a little different than doing it in person. So this next slide, let's see. Here we go. So this next slide, you do not have to do this by any means. We have a lot of resources on our assessment and strategic planning website here in Student Affairs at Auburn. Some of them I will kind of reference today. By no means do you have to click on this, but I thought that I would provide that resource to you. It's something that we continuously keep up to date. So certainly you can just scan this QR code with your phone's camera or with your laptop camera, however you want to do that, and pull up the website just so you have it as a resource, maybe save it as a bookmark. And certainly reach out to me or any of my team, you know, in the future if you have any questions or there's something that we can provide kind of on the state level of support for assessment and strategic planning for our colleagues across the state, especially as a resource for NASPA Alabama. So again, nothing you have to do, but I just wanted to provide that resource. Some things that we are going to cover today, we're going to be talking about the difference in assessment versus research. We're going to be talking about parts of the assessment cycle. What types of questions might we ask for various phases of the process? Why we assess? We're going to talk a little bit about SAC-COC. I'll explain what that is if you're not familiar with our accreditation body. In just a moment, we'll talk about types of outcomes, constructing outcomes, difference between direct and indirect methods, aligning the method with the outcome that you have written. That's an important component. We'll talk about student affairs buzzwords. I think within our own field areas, within student affairs, we have our own kind of vernacular and a vocabulary, but particularly with assessment, there are some that I'd like for you to know, and that would be helpful to you as you embark on this journey, if you will, into student affairs assessment. So you'll notice all of my slides have a little bit of a travel theme. So we're going to begin our journey with assessment and strategic planning for you as an introduction within student affairs. We'll talk about analyzing qualitative and quantitative data, a little bit about basic formats of writing up your findings, looking at some infographic options that are free to you, and then also some actions that you can take to foster a culture of assessment within your own area. I used to call them assessment champions. Now I think I'm going to start saying assessment influencers. That seems a little bit more fresh and current. But First thing that you'll need to do is figure out where you are in your skill set and determine what it is that you're wanting to know. So what kinds of questions are you wanting to ask? And then also, where are you on your assessment journey? And certainly doing things like you're doing today, we're getting a little bit of training and expertise to help expand your skill set with an assessment will be helpful, but it'll help you to know what areas you're lacking in order to grow and improve as you continue to do assessment throughout your career. And I will say, certainly my job as the Director of Assessment and Strategic Planning, I do this all day long, but it is very important for you to realize and note that assessment really carries over into every area of student affairs. Our leadership and the world that we are living in, a world of accountability, everyone is wanting to know and answer questions based on data and where things stand and how students are responding and what students need. And so regardless of your content area, I think you'll really benefit from having some of these skills. And you may have some already, so let's just further hone those if you do. So I'd be remiss if we didn't start out with at least a little bit of assessment humor. So I always use this first one. Some of you have probably seen this before if you've been in presentations with me. I love that. Mind filling out this evaluation form first, from the man who's, to the man who's about to be executed. And then this other one, I'm going to need more specific feedback on my formative assessment. And all it says is bad dog. When you're embarking on your assessment journey, it's important to keep in mind who we are asking. So perhaps it was inappropriate to ask the person who is about to be beheaded, or who is in a situation like that. How are we asking it? What method are we asking? Is it appropriate? Is it culturally sensitive? Is it a way that everybody can be accessing this information? Those kinds of things. And in what circumstances and context are we asking this information? So again, kind of back to that first cartoon. And making sure we follow up with the participants on our findings and clearly presenting our findings to them. So kind of going back to that second cartoon on the bottom, with the bad dog example, he's going to need a little bit more than that. And so, our students, as they grow within our programs and services that we provide in the co-curricular setting, it's okay to go back to them, especially if you've got student leaders or RAs in a training or anything like that, and go back and share with them ways that you've observed their behavior or they've demonstrated a skill and you see a way that they could improve upon that. Or from an assessment perspective, maybe it's more at the department level and you're doing program review or you're looking at head counts and those kinds of things. There are always ways to explain those findings and share those findings and make sure that everybody is on the same page. So very important there. Another reason I like that top cartoon is sometimes I'll start with assessment can be a little bit scary, and it doesn't have to be scary. Sometimes folks might see it as something that's going to be a form of judgment or a spotlight shining on their work. And maybe that's good, or maybe that's bad. Or maybe they're just not comfortable with that attention. Some might view it as extra work and something that they just don't have time to do right now. Or maybe it's superfluous. Never has there been a more important time to capture information than the world we are living in right now. Even with the pandemic and everything that's going on, I would say that's probably even more important because we've never done this before. And so it'll be helpful as we continue to move forward to document where we are and know how to best serve our students. I'd be willing to bet your campuses have done some student needs surveys in regard to COVID or other things throughout this pandemic and returning to work and vaccines and all kinds of things. And those are all assessment techniques that decision makers use to shape policies, programs, procedures, and services that we provide to our students, faculty, and staff. It's important to understand why we assess and what is assessment. So back to our travel example, this is where you're kind of packing your bag for the right destination. So, you don't want to pack that, swimsuit if you're going to Antarctica kind of thing. So know where you are planning to go, and we'll talk about the different phases of the assessment cycle. We're, for the purpose of this presentation, going to talk about the planning phase as kind of the map for your journey. The gathering phase where you're collecting that evidence, perhaps that's the trip itself, and you're collecting souvenirs or photographs or, anything like that. And then the analysis side of it, perhaps that's, reviewing your photo album at the end of your trip or sharing about your journey or something like that. So we'll kind of stick with that journey theme throughout. Assessment provides opportunities and excellent areas for self-improvement and for your own departments, but it's important to note that it's not research. So while they both are grounded and have a format for making sure that you have a structure in the way that you are writing your questions and writing outcomes and making sure that you have a method that is appropriate for what it is that you're setting out to measure. Research is a little bit different where you're disproving or proving a theory. or a hypothesis, where assessment is more to inform your everyday actual work and the things that you do. So just a real quick definition, assessment is any effort to gather, analyze, and interpret evidence, going back to the 3 phases I talked about just a moment ago, which describe institutional, departmental, divisional, or agency effectiveness. So a little bit different there when it comes to research versus assessment. And another thing to note is that assessment is not static. So it's ongoing, it could be ever changing. What works this year might be inappropriate for the following year for the way that you're doing your survey or reaching out to students. And it changes with our student body, with our campus climate, with our tools and resources that are available, et cetera, rather than, some longitudinal research study that might be going on for a while. This is an oldie but a goodie. If you've read any assessment book over the last several years, you'll see something like this. And I always add to it this bottom part that's in all caps about sharing successes. So again, kind of going back to that journey, the planning phase is kind of that middle to the bottom left area about knowing your mission, your purpose, your goals, implementing those outcomes. We're getting to the trip itself, where we're going to gather that evidence and interpret that evidence. And then those final phases, maybe where we're putting together that photo album and making meaning of our trip. And so that's where we're going to interpret, and most importantly, like you would with any trip, maybe it's on social media or however, but make sure that you are sharing your findings. And that's the most important piece, because there's no reason to ask these questions and to do this assessment if no one else is seeing it and it's not driving improvement or data information, informing, policies or practices within your own areas. Obviously, this is a continuous cycle. Assessment is cyclical. And I would also mention that if you are just starting, particularly if your institution is just starting on an assessment journey, or your division, probably a good idea to come up with a common language, define kind of that center area. What is a mission statement to you? What is a vision statement? What are values? What are goals or objectives or outcomes? Because they can be interchanged depending on the institution where you are and the way that your division is interpreting the meaning of those things. So here at Auburn, we have our own common language of what an outcome is to us. And how long a goal is for, and those kinds of things. Okay, so the third area that I mentioned that we would talk about is questions to ask for each phase of the assessment cycle. So this is that map, okay? So this is where you're figuring out what it is that you want to do, what is important to do to you, what are those core values, your mission, all of that part that was in the center part of that cycle that I just showed you. And the questions and things that you're going to ask for this first phase are things like, what are we trying to do? What do we want to accomplish? What do we want our students or stakeholders to be able to know, think, or do? When you're implementing them, how can I reach my target audience, and what is the best way to approach this method or this assessment project? So why should we assess? We want to assess to measure progress, to continuously improve, to make informed decisions, obviously to tell our story. I think that's the biggest piece in what we do. And then, to me, those should be the first reasons. There are some studies that show that senior leadership and other things, other groups might say the first reason we do this is for accreditation or for accountability or for financial justification. And certainly those things play a part, but I wouldn't say that's why we do it. We do it to be better and to provide good and stronger and even better programs and services than we already do for our students in that co-curricular setting. So why do we assess in student affairs? We do this to have an end in mind when we're implementing changes so that we know where we're headed and when we get there, to document decisions based on results, to measure the intended outcomes that we set out to achieve, obviously to demonstrate that value, to help prioritization, to ensure that our students are actually learning and growing within the services and programs that we provide to them. Assessment results are often used to guide changes. You've heard me already talk about that a good bit. And as student affairs professionals who constantly plan programs and services for students, assessment is really critical to know what is working, what needs to be sunset, what needs to be revamped, what needs to be continued. And that's a really great way to do that, is to ask these kinds of questions and collect this information from your student body. One of the tools that I mentioned, tool 5, I believe, is parts of the assessment report. So SAC-COC, which is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. So for most of us, if not all of us, we are SAC-COC accredited schools. So this is our accrediting body, and they provide requirements and standards, if you will, that each institution is required to meet in order to maintain that accreditation level. And that's very important. So of course, they're looking for student outcomes in the educational setting. They're looking for them in the general education setting, general core curriculum outcomes, those kinds of things, gen ed outcomes, but they're also looking for them in services that are provided to students. And so that's where we come in. If you are wanting to look more into the SAC COC requirements and standards for student affairs, 8.2.c, if you speak SAC's language, is kind of where you're going to want to be looking. But particularly, I'm going to read this one. The institution identifies expected outcomes, assesses the extent to which it achieves these outcomes, and provides evidence of seeking improvement based on analysis of the results for academic and student services that support student success. So there you go. So it is very important that we are making sure that we do this assessment cycle, like I mentioned, for continuous improvement, for our own strategic planning, for our own growth and the programs that we provide for students. Then if we're doing that well, then this box is already checked in terms of having everything we need for our accreditation cycle and requirements. So strategic planning and assessment go hand in hand. You've heard me mention outcomes, and that's a big piece. So it's very helpful, of course, to make sure that you've got your vision and your mission in line, and you're thinking about how you are going to measure outcomes that support those larger elements. Strategic planning and assessment obviously have that connection where we're thinking about what are the outcomes that we want to achieve. And just a quick definition, this is kind of the way that we define them here at Auburn. Outcomes are identifiable, measurable end results of a program or a service here at Auburn. So essentially the outcomes are what it is that you're wanting students to know, think, or be able to do, or what it is that you're wanting your department to be able to achieve or accomplish. So I just highlighted two different types of examples, and so we'll break it and we'll jump into those just a little bit. So I mentioned at the first or second slide, we talked about some of the things that we would cover. One of those was types of outcomes, and another was constructing an outcome. So very quickly, some of you that work at Auburn have probably heard me talk about this. I feel like I wear these things as a sandwich board when I'm meeting with departments, but program outcomes, again, are going to be something that your department is looking to accomplish. And this is the way we define them. So you might have a little bit of a common language difference, but basically it's all about the same. Some people might call them program performance and learning outcomes. So you can look at them different ways, but essentially we break it up to it's a learning outcome or it's not. So program outcomes examine what that office is looking to achieve. Perhaps this is looking at student satisfaction, you're doing program review, program evaluation. A lot of times this is purely just measures and attendance, bean counting, tracking, budgets, those kinds of things. Learning outcomes, however, are going to be where the student is actually demonstrating what they know, think, or do as a result of participating in your program or your service. And most of the time, of course, our outcomes are involving students, but sometimes, depending on your field area, it might be parents, or it might be donors, or it might be alumni. So just something else to think about there. In my case, it's our staff, because I work with staff rather than our students. Okay, so I won't cover this much because the tail end of what I heard from the last session was that Lauren and Jennifer were talking about blooms, and I was so excited when I got on and heard them talking about that. So you've heard about blooms, and one thing I just wanted to reiterate is that when you are writing an outcome, you want to use a Bloom's taxonomy action verb. The slide that I have in front of you is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just a quick reference, but you can Google or quickly look, or also look on our website. We have some resources there to find action verbs that align with the level of complexity for what it is that you're wanting students to be able to do. So you're going to go from that basic level of remembering all the way up to that higher level of evaluating or creating, and in some versions you'll see synthesizing there as well. So I'm going to give you just a second, and if you want to put it in the chat, this might be the best way to do this. Just jot, it does not have to be perfect, but write an outcome and put it in the chat. So an outcome is, as a result of participating in a program or a service, students will be able to insert action verb. So just put that in there. It could be for anything that you are wanting to, and I'll give you an example too. Let me go to the next slide. Here's an example. So you can put that in the chat. Oh, thanks, Shelby. As a result of participating in TESSI, which is our Tiger Education Screening and Intervention Program, our initiative, students will be able to summarize the effects of alcohol on the body. Okay, great. So she's got an action verb in there that is appropriate. And she's got summarize. And so, again, kind of making sure that the outcome aligns with the measure of learning there. If you want to throw yours in the chat, you can. Thank you, Shelby, for the example. And we will move on. This is so different where I can't see you guys. Okay. Okay. So the next part of that assessment journey, and you guys bear with me because I'm trying to give you a very broad overview of some super complex pieces. Oh, thank you, Danny. He put one in there. As a result of attending the session, 100% of participants will love assessment and feel comfortable using it in their day-to-day practice. That is my kind of outcome, Danny. I love it. So I'm going to cover a lot of material, and obviously we have a limited amount of time. So I love to talk about this. I'll be happy to follow up with anybody that's got questions, but bear with me. We're just going to kind of scratch the surface as we move through this presentation. So select the correct tools and prepare to embark. This is where we are in this phase of the journey. So you'll see the image here where she's kind of getting her things together and she's getting ready to go. The first thing that you're going to want to do, and I have a really great infographic for this on our website. It doesn't translate well to a slide, so we kind of made a dumbed down version for a slide. But I'm really proud of this, and I want to share it with you because it will help you determine what type of method you want to use based on the type of outcome that you've written. So will you be measuring what a student is to know, think, or do? If that's the case, then you'll follow that left-hand side, yes. Will stakeholders or be displaying their knowledge to you? So just another check to make sure that you're going to have a direct method. If the answer to that is yes, then you're going to follow down and choose either quantitative or qualitative methods, which we'll talk about in just a second. If the answer to those questions was no, then you're going to use an indirect method. While, of course, just for best practice, you want to make sure that your outcome and your method align. Also for accreditation purposes, and I can tell you firsthand, I have heard from accreditors when they come and do their site visits and things like that, they want to see that you are able to align your methods with the type of outcome that you chose. So an example might be that you set out and said you had a learning outcome where students were going to demonstrate something, and then you gave them a satisfaction survey. And those two things don't go together because a satisfaction survey would not give you an indication of what they did or did not learn. It would only show you how well they were satisfied or how dissatisfied they were with an opportunity that you presented. Okay. So I said we talk about quantitative and qualitative methods. So I thought this cartoon was really great. Only 1 in 30 take the free ice cream. Interesting. So that's for quantitative methods. For qualitative methods, what did you feel when you saw the free ice cream? Excited, a little scared, and why was that? Okay, so pretend you are the person asking those questions. So if you are wanting to get more numerical information, you're going to do quantitative analysis versus if you're wanting to know the fuzzies and the hows of an experience, then you're going to want to do a qualitative assessment. Some examples of quantitative, these are things that I'm sure you've heard before, so we don't have to spend a ton of time. Things like surveys, looking at existing data. It could be a rubric if there are numbers assigned to the rubric, perhaps. Tracking systems, observations, document analysis. And then for qualitative methods, it's going to be things like reflective journals, or it's going to be a focus group or an interview. Perhaps you've transcribed those. It could be some visual methods. Perhaps you gave them a prompt and said, go take photographs and come back and tell me what it looks like for, COVID safety on our campus or something like that. And then obviously there's mixed methods where you could apply both techniques, where you might do a focus group that helps you inform a survey that you're going to create, or vice versa. You might have gotten a survey and you have a score of 3.5 on something, but you don't know why they felt 3 out of 5, 3.5 on a scale of agree to disagree. And so now you want to do a focus group to follow up on the how or the why that took place and why that's happening. Okay. So now we know a little bit about the introduction to assessment, making sure that you've got the map laid out of where you're going to go, and you have a little bit of information to kind of pack your bag and get ready to take that trip. So let's talk about actually using the information and implementing that outcome. So this is the gathering the evidence piece. So this is where you're actually filling your backpack as you're on your trip. Perhaps these are the souvenirs that you're collecting along the way. This is your data, okay? So the types of things that you want to be asking when you are collecting data are what information are being collected, how do we know that we are doing this well, and just kind of keep in check with that as you are continuing to gather your evidence. Okay, so I mentioned a moment ago about direct and indirect methods on the decision tree that you saw. And so I really like this little graphic, and it's going to say on a kind of objectivity to subjectivity, whether you do direct or indirect methods. So direct method, again, things that can be directly observed versus indirect methods, things that cannot be directly observed and have an impact on a directly observable behavior. So again, indirect measures are more of a reflection or where you're doing some counting or some tracking, whereas the direct method, the student or participant is actually demonstrating knowledge to you in some way or form. So direct methods, they help to make sure that you are properly measuring what it is the student set out to do. Making sure I'm following my chats here. Yep. It will give you a little bit more confidence when you're sharing this data because it's direct method. In that way, it's a little bit more well received in the academic world anyway. Helps with accreditors because they are wanting to make sure that we are directly measuring student learning outcomes in, of course, academic setting and the co-curricular setting. And then indirect methods, those are certainly good and appropriate too. It depends on the type of outcome that you have, right? So indirect methods would be things like grades, because a grade doesn't tell you what a student knows, thinks, or does. Scores, questionnaire, it could be a method that you would give out for that. Maybe it is an interview or a focus group. Those would all be examples of indirect methods. And the direct methods, of course, would be things like a writing sample or a test or an essay or an oral exam. And sometimes in student affairs, we can kind of make these things fun. Maybe they don't know they're taking a test. Build your survey for your experience that has educational type questions in it. So, you've presented material to students. Let's say it's a leadership training. You've presented material to students. You've given them, maybe a survey before and after, or maybe a survey after, but your questions are worded in a way where they are demonstrating knowledge that they acquired during that training. And there you go. You've got a direct method right there for student affairs. So let's do a little practice. So I like to do these. I've changed them up if anybody's done these with me before. So these are some different examples. I know I've got some folks that work at Auburn. So these are new. So for the statement below, identify whether the statement is a direct or indirect measure of learning. How do you know? Okay, so students indicate their level of competence leading conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion, using a rubric. So they're indicating their level. You can just put it in the chat. Is it direct or indirect? Anybody want to be a brave soul? So just a reminder, if the student is saying their own level of competence, then it's going to be indirect, okay? So I don't think I saw anybody respond there. It's circling, so, okay. So this is going to be indirect. So the student is indicating their own level of competence leading the conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that should have been. And so while rubrics are often used for assessing a direct measure of learning, don't let that throw you off. That was a little bit of a trick. These would be indirect because the students are evaluating themselves, okay? It's another practice. If anybody wants to throw direct or indirect in the chat, feel free to do that. Students rate their peers on group fitness instruction abilities using a rubric. Come on, guys. All right, so I'll share that. So it's direct, okay? So students are observing the evidence the peers are providing of their skills. So in this case, because they are observing a behavior that had been learned, this would be a direct method, okay? You guys are building the tools. Your luggage is getting full. All right, you're packing your bags. Okay, a staff member from the University Housing Office administers a quiz both before and after a resident advisor training. Would this be direct or indirect? Okay, in this case, it's going to be direct. So a quiz has correct and incorrect answers and the knowledge to assess the student's knowledge. So by administering the quiz before and after the training, they can determine the knowledge of level had increased or did not increase. Okay. Last practice. After After an orientation program related to academic advising, students articulate the steps to take to register for classes, and orientation leaders count the number of correct versus incorrect answers. Oh, I'm loving it, Danny. You're both testing your brain power. And some of these can be, depending, I don't know if that was for the last question or for this one, but depending on the way you present the prompt, or depending on the way the instrument is designed, they could be direct or indirect. And that's where this gets a little bit tricky, and you've got to really understand what it is that you want to know. Okay, after an orientation program related to academic advising, students articulate the steps to take to register for classes, and orientation leaders count the number of correct versus incorrect answers. Okay, so in this case, it's direct. Students outline what they think the steps are, so they've been taught the steps. And then, you're welcome, I'm so glad this is helpful. And then the orientation leaders use that evidence to determine if they adequately learned how to register, okay? So, and of course, then they would adapt their training, and, you know, in best practice, they would adjust and make sure that everybody had that material, because that would be really important for orientation leaders. Okay, so the 9th thing that I mentioned on that first slide, it was a whole list of things that we said we'd cover. One of them was aligning the method with the outcome. And I've talked about that a little bit. So things you're going to want to make sure to do. If you are using an outcome that's quantitative, you know, a method that's going to be quantitative to align with your outcome, that's going to have numbers, you're going to be tracking participation, I wanted to provide you with some examples of types of methods that you might use to capture that information. So perhaps you are looking at existing data. You know, maybe this is existing documents, existing spreadsheets, maybe this is banner data, I don't know. Maybe you're looking at things within your Engage system with Anthology Campus Labs. Maybe it's tracking systems, your calendaring system, key performance indicators. That's what KPI stands for. Okay, so if you're wanting student needs, so we get this question a lot in our office, and we help a lot with student needs surveys. So this helps you to keep aware of the student body and specific populations. Like I mentioned, we've done some of that with COVID and for other things. So here you might want to do a survey. Or perhaps you want to know more and you want to know more detail. So you're going to do a focus group. Or like I mentioned, that visual methods, my example of go around, take pictures of what, you know, campus safety looks like in terms of COVID, and put it with this hashtag on social media. And then you have a way to go back and see what students are saying and thinking and feeling, and then you'll analyze that, okay? So that's one way to do student needs. Program effectiveness. This is another one I get a lot of questions about. So levels of satisfaction, involvement, you know, effectiveness overall, helpfulness, customer service, those kinds of things. We get that a lot in student affairs, right? That's really important. So again, this might be a survey. Perhaps it's a focus group. I really love an observation here. Maybe it's a secret shopper. You can do all kinds of things. So those would be outcomes that would align with, or those would be methods that will align with these types of outcomes. Some other examples on that end. These are kind of questions that I get a lot for different types of studies or things that folks are having questions about. So let's say it's cost effectiveness. So here, again, it might be existing data, looking at budgets. Perhaps you're doing some benchmarking and looking at comparative data, you know, your area to somewhere else. Again, it might be analyzing key performance indicators. Perhaps it's after action reports. You know, was the cost worth the number of students who attended? You know, did we have enough turnout? Those kinds of things. Campus climate or environment. So here, focus groups, document analysis is a good one. Go back and see, you know, what students are saying or what evidence are there. Maybe it's policies or procedures, could be all kinds of things. Maybe it's activism, you know, I don't know, that you're tracking. Survey data, existing data, of course, case studies would be good about a certain student organization or a certain student group or a certain population of students, those kinds of things. And then comparative. So here you're just doing general benchmarking. Maybe you're looking at yourself compared to other departments within student affairs. Maybe you're looking at your institution compared to aspirant institutions or institutions like you, or land grant institutions, or you know, SREB schools, all those different things. Southern Regional Education Board. So it could be a lot of different things. So survey data, rubrics, existing data, and key performance indicators. So if you get hung up on this, just know that you can always go back and look at slides from this presentation. I'll be happy to share those. Or again, visit our website. We've got a lot of materials on just out to the public for assessment and strategic planning. And of course, I'm always available for any questions to help my colleagues within the state. Okay, so method outcome alignment. So we were talking about that just a little bit, and you're going to want to make sure that the level of Bloom's taxonomy action verb that you selected for your outcome is appropriate for what you're asking your students or your participants to be able to do. Okay, so continuing on with those examples, if you're using national norms or standards, you might want to, again, be thinking about surveys, document analysis, existing data. And if you're doing learning outcomes, like I just mentioned, you're going to want to align those things and follow up with a survey, a quiz. You might do a rubric where you are, evaluating student writing, or you have a checklist, something that's going to standardize your measurement across whatever's being turned into you, where you can directly assess what the students are able to know, think, or do. So the next phase is interpreting the evidence. So here, I just chose this photograph where you're trying to draw meaning and analyze, kind of after the fact. What happened? What data do I have? How am I going to share these findings? What do these data mean? You're going to ask questions like, how well are we doing with what we're trying to accomplish? Where are we on that process? Did we achieve our goal? How do we find, what do our findings tell us about how to proceed, how to move forward? How do we be data informed to perform the best work that we can and the services that we provide for our students? And then make decisions for improvement. How do we use the information to improve and celebrate success? So I mentioned a little bit about buzzwords. There are some things in particular that I want to note here. I covered benchmarking a minute ago about being able to compare yourself internally or externally to peers. I've covered SAC-COC a little bit. That's our Commission on Colleges, our accrediting body. Baseline data, of course, is where you're wanting to just capture overall, initially, what do we have? Where are we? So that we can set targets as we move forward. You'll see that a lot in strategic planning as well, where, here's our baseline, and then each year we hope to increase or improve in a certain way. The NASPA-ACPA professional competencies are a very helpful tool for those of you who are new professionals, and particularly within your assessment journey. I'm going to pull that up in just a second if I can switch sharing my screen. We'll see how that goes, because I want you to see the rubric for that and understand that there are some competencies that you can just kind of do your own assessment and see where you are, again, to make sure that you are getting the right professional development that you need. The CAS standards, that's another big one for student affairs. So these are our guidelines for our content or field areas within student affairs. I'll share that in just a moment as well, that website. And then the ASK standards, which are the ACPA ASK standards articulate areas of assessment and skills and knowledge needed by student affairs professionals. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quickly, and I want to show you, let's show my other screen. Okay, so this is the CAS website, and I just wanted to show you, hopefully you can see that. You may not be able to, so I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So what I wanted to show you is the examples of the different field areas within student affairs that there are CAS standards for. And the newest version was 2019, so they're fairly new. Academic advising, alcohol and drug, you'll see assessment services. I'm just going to scroll down so you can kind of see. I don't have to read every one. But if you're not familiar with CAS standards, go find them and look them up and make sure that you and your office are operating within the guidelines set out by CAS. These are a paid for product, so likely someone somewhere in your division has paid for these, so you probably wouldn't have to buy them again. For folks that work at Auburn, if you're on this call, they live within my office and we can share those with you. And there are, Shelby already knows because her office is undergoing program review under the oversight of my office right now. And we've made those materials available. So just kind of scrolling down to show you what are the different field areas. There are also cross-functional frameworks that are available for areas. I'll use Shelby Flores since she's on the call. Her area would be an example, health promotion and wellness service, where they have a couple of different CAS standards that fall within their department. Perhaps it's ones on, survivor sexual assault. Perhaps it's one on alcohol and other drugs. Maybe it's nutrition, et cetera. And so they would have a couple of different ones that they would want to use. So there is a cross-functional framework for that. So just wanted to share those with you really quickly. Okay, so going back to the buzzwords, that's a little bit about the CAS standards. Okay. So as I just showed you, there are about 47 functional area standards for higher ed student affairs programs within CAS. And again, they're available online. It's a paid for product. So certainly purchase those for your division if they do not already have them. And more than likely someone does. So make sure you found those. They're very helpful to you. So I just mentioned the cross-functional framework. The first thing you're going to want to look for is for your particular field area within student affairs, your functional area standards. You could look, like I mentioned, for a cross-functional framework. And then there are also self-assessment guides. So my office right now, Assessment and Strategic Planning at Auburn, each week, our staff members within my team, we're going through the Assessment Services SAG, which is the self-assessment guide. Each week, we're just taking a little piece of that and making sure that our office is doing everything we need to do to meet and exceed those standards set before us as an Office of Assessment Services as defined by CAS. So probably a good idea for your office to do that too. We also are the leaders of program review on our campus for the co-curricular setting. And so of course we want to provide a good example and make sure that we have done, what we are asking others to do. So we're doing the same. Just a good idea there for you if you're not familiar with CAS. Okay. So there are 12 parts to those standards that I just showed you. And if you'll notice, the reason that I mentioned that assessment is a part of every field area within student affairs. So part 4 there, assessment. We've got mission, programs, students, student learning, assessment, equity, diversity, inclusion, access, leadership, et cetera, human resources, all the way through facilities and infrastructure. Now, going back to what I was talking about with quantitative analysis, so quantitative findings. So now you've got your data, you've packed your bag, you've gone on your trip, you've analyzed your photographs, or I'm just using that as an example, you've analyzed your data, and or you've gotten the data and you're trying to figure out how to analyze it. So you either have quantitative findings or you have qualitative findings. And so here we'll talk with the interpretation of breaking up the steps between qualitative and quantitative. So really quickly, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, I think you've probably all heard of these things before, with descriptive statistics, which is kind of the most basic starting place with your quantitative data. You're going to have measures of frequency, central tendency, dispersion, variation, and position. I'll just cover those things really quickly. No surprise, of course, positions can be percentiles, quartiles, your dispersion or variation is your range. Standard deviation, et cetera. Measures of central tendency are exactly what they sound like, and you all know those. And measures of frequency, of course, are counts and percentages. So a measure of position would be an example like an ACT score. Okay, so here's an example for interpreting a measure of frequency. So take just a second and review this example. Why might you choose to report one statistic in raw count versus percentage? Anybody know? Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. But the answer is that when you're comparing years, it's better to use percentages because they're standardized, right? So you might have different counts every year of students. And so then the count of people who, are responding, who are graduating and those kinds of things would not be the same. And so might be in that case, it would be better to share in percentages. So just a tip about interpreting that type of data. So now you've got descriptive data. These are frequencies. Based on the question and visuals on this slide, interpret the findings to answer this question. What is your single most effective practice for attracting students to your event? Anybody want to put it in the chat? Giveaways, right? So it's showing giveaways pretty clearly, but giveaways at 25%, very visually, you can see that. Or of course, down on the bottom, you can see that as well at 204. This is a really good one, and I think we run into this a lot. So a measure of central tendency. So Mr. Stingy over here, Mr. Stingy, I've heard that you pay your employees very poorly. That is an evil lie. The average salary in my company is $91,000 a year. Okay, Mr. Stingy, that's not bad for a mean salary, but what is the median salary of your company? Well, the median salary is $80,000 per year. Your accusations are unreasonable. Sounds good, Mr. Stingy, but the mode, Mr. Stingy, what is the mode? And if you look at the example, the salary scale ranges from $300,000 to a clerk at $20,000, and there are 3 clerks at $20,000, and there's 1 person at $300,000. So that's where getting into central tendency is really important, to also look at things like mean, median, and mode, and break those out in various ways when you're presenting your findings, because it may not be an accurate representation if you just say, well, the average salary in my company is $91,000 a year, yet, you've got multiple people, or, a third of your workforce that's making $20,000 a year, okay? Just a quick example. Inferential statistics. So this is where you would draw some meaning from the same group or same sample within work that you're doing. These would be things like correlations, chi-squares, t-test. If you use Campus Labs Anthology, which used to be Baseline, most of what they do if they're showing you a comparison report would be a t-test. So they're oftentimes showing you that. And here's an example of one. So using Campus Labs or Anthology now, since it's been purchased, is nice because you can very quickly see from a t-test that there was a 0.15, statistically significant difference between the 2017 segments being analyzed here between, this would be Auburn, and the national average. Okay? And then how to report t-test findings. So you would just write this finding, the one that I just shared with you, up, and you would say, in our case, Auburn students surveyed, you would put in how many there were, and rated their ability to work in teams at a significantly higher level than the national average of students surveyed on this instrument. Auburn students reported a mean score of 3.67 compared to a mean score of 3.52 on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being beginner and 5 being expert. So that's the very academic way to say it. If you're talking to your boss and you want to give them an executive summary, you don't have to be so wordy. But if you're writing it up, I want you to know how to do that. So that's what you do. So now we're going to talk about qualitative findings. So again, this is if you've done a focus group or an interview. And really quickly, we'll just go through this. I just want you to see that you essentially organize your data. You're going to break it up into themes. You're going to break it down into codes. You're going to read through that a few times until you've reached saturation. And then you're going to get down to kind of overall what these data tell you from your interview or your focus group that you have conducted. Things that you're going to make sure that you want to know how to do are the basic principles of qualitative and quantitative analysis, how research articles are put together, increasingly complex levels, how to read those things, research articles, and then how to evaluate the quality of research. So that being said, you want to make sure that you are following kind of a similar format. This is for any academic writing, essentially, of title. I'll just show you an example here. So you've got, the purpose statement, the problem, who are the participants, what was the design or methodology, what were the what were the findings, what were the results, and then what conclusions did you draw? And if you look closely at that, for those of you that work at Auburn, or I bet at any school where you work, if you write annual effectiveness reports or whatever you call them, assessment reports, probably follows a very similar structure. That's one, because it's just an academic best practice. And two, because for accreditation purposes, they're looking to make sure that we have that outcome, that method alignment, how we, what did the findings tell us, and most importantly, how did we use those findings for improvement? Okay. So now what? Interpreting results and making improvements. Identifying themes, you're going to look for strengths and weaknesses. And perhaps you want to share your findings with a one-pager, an executive summary, maybe a newsletter or a website. And I just wanted to share with you some free resources, and that's why I gave you that QR code to our website. If you click on software and then it's like other software, these are some free things. I don't get any kind of kickbacks from this. I just think they're great tools. Engage is one that I particularly like, and Canva. So here is Engage. This is an example of Auburn's screenshot of what Engage looks like. And you can tell we've used them for lots of ways to break down our data and do some easy one-pagers. Certainly you can use Creative Cloud Adobe products, but this is a really quick way. This one is a paid for product, but is very low cost. So we have one divisional license and we can all use it. So that's nice. Okay, so some things you can do to be an assessment influencer. Be that assessment champion, build your own assessment capacity. and work with your supervisor to set expectations, et cetera, and contribute to being intentional about what it is that you are wanting to do. That was very quick and a lot of material, but now we are back in the airport. We have gone through the assessment process and talked through the assessment journey. So what questions can I answer for you? Feel free to turn on your audio if you need to. I think we're nearing the end of our time. Turn on your audio or put them in the chat.
Hey, Abby.
Hey.
Hey, thank you so much for this conversation. I think it was super helpful and showed me how much more I have to learn about assessment. But I think in reflecting back to my time as a new professional, and I'd love to get your insights, assessment to me back then was really like, did you like this? Yes or no? As I thought about like when I was an RA and I was planning programs and I was getting feedback from people, it was just kind of like, are you happy? Yeah, cool. How do you start to build that muscle? And I think some of the things that you showed now are really incredible tools, things that you can use. But for some people who are brand new to assessment, what do you think are some of the resources that they should look at, or how they should start looking at language, which I think you shared a lot of, like even how you ask questions that would be helpful to have an understanding on how to build that muscle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those, there's another cartoon that floats around of like, I'm at the end of my 3-year project and they say I need an evaluation. How do I do that? And it's like, you don't want to be in that situation. So I do think it's important to have that common language. I think it's important to figure out the types of questions that you want to ask. What is it that you really want to know? And can you dig a little deeper than was the student satisfied, or what was the overall student experience of this large thing, if you want to break it down in other ways, or not be so shallow with your questions as far as not being deep with information. Some things that we have done in student affairs here at Auburn, one of the first things I did was create a common language, but then the second thing was to we have an assessment team. So we have a departmental assessment team. Somebody from every area within the division represents their department, and we meet monthly to talk and see what's going on. So that helps build a little bit of buy-in and get those influencers going. But then also we have an assessment curriculum that we built here at Auburn that is very helpful, and our staff participate in that with really great numbers and a lot of buy-in. If your school doesn't have that, that's okay. Again, get no kickback for this, but I think it's a really great thing. There are 2 options. There is the Campus Labs curriculum. They offer one. It's through Anthology. And then also through the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Listserv, there's a MOOC that's free on assessment. So if people just want a little bit more experience, that's another way that'll help you, Danny, to get to being able to ask those deeper questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
The other thing that popped into my mind while you were talking about it, as I've learned about assessment and evaluation generally, I've realized that the power of that tool comes not just at the end, but like what you do with pre-assessment, what you do with midpoint checkpoints, and how you're able to evolve programs, at least the ones that I've run, kind of as you're moving. So like I do a program and it might be a part of a series, and after the first program, I'll run a quick like 2-3 question assessment and get some feedback that lets me evolve the next part in that series.
100%. So you're talking about formative assessment and summative assessment. Mm-hmm. So I do the same thing when I'm teaching a class here in the higher ed program or anything else. We do a lot of those 1-minute assessments at the end of class of like, what were the most pressing questions you had? What's going well? Those kinds of things. And then you literally adjust the class the next time to make sure that you're addressing those questions. So when you get to the evaluation at the end, you're going to have good results because you're going to make sure that everybody's covered that material, or that you've answered those questions or adjusted your technique to reach those students. Yes, that's exactly right.
Well, thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks. It's nice to put a face too. I feel like we've communicated so many times. So thanks for your help.
Yes. Have a great day.
You too. Any other questions? All right, everybody. Well, if you have further questions, my contact information is on the screen. I will encourage you as well. We are looking to fill some board positions with NASPA Alabama. If you are interested in getting more involved, please make sure that you go onto the Hop-In website. I think we have kind of an area set aside to indicate some interest in getting involved in NASPA Alabama. So we'll be checking that towards the end of the conference and make sure that you indicate your interest there, whether it's filling a board position or even just connecting in any other way. Maybe it's through the conference planning committee or anything else. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of NPI and the conference tomorrow.